Welcome Internet. Today we're going to be talking about Capgras syndrome, also called Capgras delusion, which was theorized by a French psychiatrist called Joseph Capgras. He didn't call it by his name. How he called it was le délire des sosies, meaning a delusion of doubles. A sosie is someone that looks alike, a look-alike. So fundamentally, what is this delusion about? This delusion is about the fact that people in the environment of the patient, in the eyes of the patient, are no longer there, but they've been replaced by an imposter, someone that is pretending, a bit like an evil doppelganger. It's a relatively rare condition, as it only touches about 1%-ish of psychiatric patients. But what we do know is that people who have dementia, schizophrenia, for example, strokes, are more at risk of having Capgras, as our understanding of it is neurological. That something in the brain doesn't quite work properly. So one of the illnesses, neurological illnesses, that is often put on the same kind of level as Capgras is prosopagnosia. So what is prosopagnosia? It's the inability to recognize faces. So what we now believe is that, a bit like prosopagnosia, it's the same type of issue. However, in prosopagnosia, the features aren't recognized. Therefore, the person seeing another face does not recognize the face. But in the case of Capgras, what is happening is that the person recognizes the face, but there is no emotional connection to the face that they're seeing. Therefore, that disconnect between their feelings and the face that they're seeing, the face that should be the face of their loved one, creates a feeling of uneasiness, of deep strangeness that they can only explain via the delusion. That it has to be an imposter. I don't feel anything for that person. Therefore, it cannot be X or Y because I know X or Y and I know how I feel. I love them. And that person there is not X and Y. I don't feel anything for them. So it's because of that strangeness that there's apparently a reinterpretation of what is happening. One should also note that often in Capgras syndrome, the doppelgangers, the doubles, are malevolent. They're all there to gain an advantage, to replace the person, to basically harm or hurt the patient. That therefore the patient is often very suspicious, if not outright violent, with those people, as he feels that he might be under threat from them. Of course, as many delusions, you can't just talk your way out of it, and the person cannot be talked into agreeing that it cannot be an imposter. The person is completely convinced about that. So how does it work when we try to help people with Capgras? So therapeutically, what is often advised is to associate the family with treatment. Why? It's fundamentally because they don't recognize their family anymore, or they feel that their family can be full of imposters. It is important to explain to the families what is this disorder, how does it work. Apparently, there is also a very interesting way of dealing with it. Is, for example, to introduce oneself before the person sees the face of the person. For example, let's say you come from behind the patient and you say, "Oh, this is me, W." And the person is like, "Oh, W." And apparently it minimizes the risk of Capgras triggering. Fundamentally, the person has already an idea of who's behind him. So of course it's not a miracle technique and it doesn't work all the time, but apparently it does kind of help to introduce yourself without the person seeing you. Because there's not that direct disconnect between what is seen and what they're feeling. And because they don't see you, they have the voice, that's easier. Also, some people with Capgras do not seem to have that issue on the phone. Like they'll phone their wife and be like, oh yeah, that's my wife, I can recognize her voice. But when they have them in front of her or them, they can't, and they say that it's an imposture and that it's a doppelganger and so on and so forth. There is also certain cases in which Capgras doesn't necessarily result in violence. Like, for example, in France, there was this famous case where a man had Capgras towards his wife, and basically, instead of rejecting his wife or the supposed imposter, he basically had sex with her. And during that intercourse, apparently he was much more gentle and much more sexually open to his wife than he would be if ever it had been his real wife. Apparently the idea here is that basically he was considering the imposter and his wife as his mistress. Therefore that split of whore Madonna was there, and was there in his delusion, which is a very famous case to say that, like, basically the delusion doesn't prevent other processes from occurring. And this example is also used to say that it's not always they're not always seen as malevolent. Some people like take it as a form of joke or a form of like them being pranked and so on and so forth. But most of them see it as a form of malevolence. So fundamentally, when we associate the families, apparently it helps. What also helps is the treatments via neuroleptics, as even though it's neurological, it appears to still be a delusion in the fact of reinterpreting the disconnect between feeling or absence of feeling and the face. So that can be also a very important point. And of course, lastly, a form of psychotherapy. So details are not known because there's not that many studies on it, and it still remains quite an obscure illness. But apparently, psychodynamics and CBT can help the person manage their emotions and perhaps also their feelings of being alone with the imposter, and also manage their feelings of frustration, of discontent, and so on and so forth. Also, and very interestingly enough, Joseph Capgras himself, the psychiatrist which theorized this concept, kind of was a psychoanalyst, so his take was very psychodynamically orientated. For him, what was happening was in the mind of the individual who had Capgras is that there was a split, and they could not allow themselves to be hostile or aggressive towards their love object. Therefore, they had to split themselves, and they had to split the representation of their loved ones internally between a good loved one, the one that was real, genuine, and the fake one. The fake one being the one that could be attacked, that could be abused because they were the bad ones, right? So a split. And I found the theory to be very interesting because even though there's a neurological component to it, it still remains very interesting to know that there can be a psychoanalytic perspective with a neurological ailment, that it's not one or the other, right? It can be both. So it's very, very interesting for me at least. And basically, the whole point of this syndrome is that for the most part, it's something that we don't know how to cure. And we can only like support and bring a form of understanding to the family and even to the person themselves, if they're receptive, of course, to understanding, which in the cases of psychosis is not always the case, as they have another form of blindness towards the symptoms, which we call in the profession anosognosia, i.e. they can't see what their symptoms are, they can't realize them with a full, acute and accurate capacity. And basically, and fundamentally, also what I should say is that schizophrenia, out of all the Capgras cases, seems to be the most prevalent comorbidity, i.e. A disorder that goes together with Capgras seems to be schizophrenia, which represents 54% of the cases. And fundamentally, this is very interesting because it shows that you can have one ailment and you can have another, and that neurology and psychology and psychiatry kind of are at a crossroad and a cross section, which I've always believed to be the case. That it's not just one, the other. It kind of all mixes in, and Capgras is a good example of this mixing of all those disciplines. Well, that's pretty much it. So I hope you liked this video. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment. I'll see you in the next one.